Jerome Powell, the U.S. Fed chairman, said the U.S. is on an unsustainable fiscal path. Hi, I'm Dave Lopez, founder and managing member at ILG Financial.
And I'm Chase Lopez, advisor at ILG Financial. And this is another episode of Retire Your Way with ILG Financial, where we talk all things retirement planning. Now, don't forget, hit the like and subscribe button below so you can get alerted for all of our future videos.
Yep. So let's jump right into this.
Yeah.
This is, I would say, huge news. And the reason I say it's huge news is that you may agree or you may disagree that, there's a lot of times when things are going wrong and everybody acknowledges it and everyone knows it. And we also know that the government's never going to admit to it. Well, this is one of those rare times where it's gotten, in our opinion, so bad, I think it's fair to say, that the government is actually admitting it. So this is a huge statement by Powell to say that we're on a fiscal path that's unsustainable. So here's what he's talking about. We have just, for those of you who aren't tracking it, we have just surpassed $34 trillion in debt.
That's trillion with a T.
With a T. And to put that a little bit in perspective, in the turn of the century at 2000, we were at around $5.5 trillion. So it took us over 225 years to amass $5.5 trillion in debt. And then in the next roughly 24 years, we went from 5.5 trillion to where we are now at 34 trillion.
Yeah, and it was really quite remarkable that, Jerome Powell went on 60 Minutes, which is a program that a lot of people watch, and said that we were on that unsustainable path.
Yeah.
And one of the
say it out loud.
Yeah. And one of the biggest drivers was a lot of the COVID stimulus that was pumped into the system over the last few years really kind of put us over the top with that $34 trillion number that you were mentioning.
Yeah, but the challenge is, the hope was that kind of put us over the top, but then it would slow back down, and it is not. I mean, here's what's scary about this is that we're at we just passed 34 trillion for the first time, of course, in history. Well, 3 months ago, roughly, we passed 33 trillion.
Right.
So we've added...
It's accelerating.
$1 trillion in just 3 months. This is the part that's unsustainable. And Powell, really what they go on to say is that the problem is that the debt is growing faster than the U.S. economy. And you don't have to be an economist or even a mathematician to know that if your debt's growing faster than the economy, sooner or later the whole thing's going to break.
Well, and not only did the government acknowledge that, but also Fitch, which is a credit rating agency, they actually downgraded the U.S. as far as our ability to pay that debt back, because they're acknowledging the same thing that he's acknowledging, right? They're saying, hey, this amount of debt, at some point, the U.S. isn't going to be able to pay it back, at least at the way it's currently going.
Yeah, and as I said earlier, it's that the government's now actually saying it out loud, what we all know.
Right.
But the private sector has been quietly talking about this for years, and every year they get louder and louder and more public about it. And this year in particular, more and more people are talking about it. This is an article. Let me grab my glasses here. This is an article from Jamie Dimon, who is the CEO of Morgan Stanley.
JP Morgan.
Yes. Thank you. Yes, JP Morgan. And he's talking about the same issue. He basically says, and this is his quote, mounting U.S. debt will eventually spark, and his word is here, a rebellion in the global markets. And what he means by that, a rebellion, is that our actions, our running up our debt, it doesn't just a number that has no consequences. And the consequences Jamie Dimon's talking about here is, remember, we're borrowing this money, which means someone is giving you money for the bonds. They're doing that because they believe the U.S. is going to be able to pay them back. And there's a certain point, and nobody knows what that number is, 34 trillion, 37 trillion. We don't know what that number is, where countries, nations, individual investors, people like you, foreign investors, are not going to be comfortable buying U.S. bonds because it is an unsustainable path, and they're not comfortable that they're going to be paid back.
Yeah, and that's, I think, a good way to frame it, Dave, which is these are bonds that the U.S. is issuing, right? We have to pay them back. And to your point from that same article, I think they said 7.6 trillion of that, 34 trillion we said, is owned by other countries, right? So think Japan and China, those are the biggest ones, right? And they're gonna, when those bonds come due, they're gonna want their money back, right? That's kind of the whole promise behind the whole thing. So if confidence starts to erode in our ability to pay that back, what's going to happen is we're going to have to make it more enticing, right? And how do we make it more enticing? Well, we have to raise the interest rate that's being paid on that debt, which just makes the problem worse, right?
Yep. If interest rates go up, they really go up for everything,
Right.
which means now companies pay more interest to borrow money.
Mm-hmm.
So returns in the stock market are less, and the whole economy is stifled, right? Your mortgage payments go up, your credit card payments go up, your car payments go up.
Right.
It's not something the U.S. wants,
right?
But it would be out of their control if people start losing faith in the claims paying ability of the United States. Diamond goes on to say, based on the path we're on, this fiscal path that Jerome Powell said is unsustainable, he equates it to a financial cliff that we're going to fall off. And in this cliff, he says, the problem is within about 10 years, on the path we're on, he expects our debt to exceed total U.S. annual revenue. Now, what does that mean? That means every tax dollar that we take in 10 years, if we keep this up, according to Jamie Dimon, every penny would just have to go to interest on the debt. Imagine if everything you made on your salary after taxes went to pay just the interest on your credit card. None of it went to rent, car payments, food, housing, anything. I mean, would that be a problem?
Yeah.
You bet.
Yeah, and I think the reason why this is so poignant now is some believe, right, we're kind of reaching that point, right? It's getting to kind of a crescendo. And really, what a lot of people will ask is, what happens now, right? How does the U.S. kind of rectify this issue that we have that's continuing to kind of get worse?
There's really three ways out of this mess. So one would be that the United States could try to inflate their way out of it. What does that mean? Well, the debt they've promised to repay is in U.S. dollars. Right? So they can print their own money. So they could just print, in theory, they could today print $34 trillion,
pay it all
and
off.
give it to everybody. They would have no debt, but of course the dollar would become worthless and you'd have to pay $40 for a hamburger. That's not a model that would work.
That's similar to what a lot of smaller emerging countries have done in the past, right?
Argentina's had trouble with that. And you've got a list of countries that have had hyperinflation.
Right.
And nobody wins in a hyperinflation bubble. It's a death spiral. So that's probably not going to happen. The government will do everything they can to avoid that. But you might see the inflation we've seen over the last 2 years. What I mean by that is the 3 to 9% stick around for long term. And that could be very painful. It's not hyperinflation.
Right.
But imagine if we're averaging 6 or 7% inflation for the next 10 or 15 years so the government can print their way out of this thing. That's not good for you as a retiree. It's not good for your kids as workers trying to get their legs under them and their economic future.
Right.
A huge negative, right? You have to look back to the 70s in an era of what we call stagflation. Right. When the market wasn't doing well, interest rates were high, inflation was high. That's what we would see happening from that scenario. That's one. What's number two?
Yeah, so the second one that could happen to rectify this kind of situation is the government raises more revenue dollars, right? They raise more revenue to pay some of this debt off. And the easiest way they can do that is by raising taxes.
Well, it's about the only way they can do it,
right.
Barring we discover some huge money-making thing in the ground in the U.S. Right?
That's right. So when they raise taxes, it's not only that tax brackets could go up, which could happen, of course, right? But also they'll change little things inside of the tax code to gain more revenue. So they'll change your deductions a little bit. There's a variety of different ways that they can do it, but big picture, they want to take in more revenue. How do they do that? They tax everyone a little bit more, right, to make up those gaps that they have.
Yeah, and we strongly feel, and you're going to have to make a bet on this. That's the most obvious one that's going to happen, right? Because they're in complete control of that. And a lot of people don't know this. No one likes paying taxes. Everyone we talk to thinks they're paying too much in taxes, me included. Right. But historically, if you look at the data, we are at historically low tax rates in the US compared to where we've been over the last 70 or 80 years.
Right.
So here we're at a time where we've never had more debt adjusted for inflation,
Mm-hmm.
yet we're paying less in percentage-wise of our income in taxes than we ever have in the past,
Right.
which means we're overdue for a reversion to mean to get back up to where we were in taxes. And if you can look back just in the 60s and 70s, there were periods where our tax brackets were about double roughly
Mm-hmm.
where they are today. Now, that's a huge problem if you're listening and you're in or near retirement, because if you've got the bulk of your life savings in your tax deferred accounts, which are 401ks, TSPs if you're federal government,
Right.
IRAs,
Mm-hmm.
any tax deferred, you've never paid tax on that money.
Right.
So imagine, Chase, if you've got $100,000 in this example, it could be $1 million. You've spent your whole life savings and your life saving, and you are planning to need about, I don't know, you need about $20,000 a year out of that to live off of.
Mm-hmm. Or just look at the whole account balance, right? If
So,
you have $1 million,
yeah.
that's
a great way to say it.
Yeah, if you have $1 million, right, and you're being taxed at 20%, we're just using round numbers, right? But 20%, well, you don't actually have $1 million in that account, right? You have $1 million less the 20% you have to pay in taxes, $800,000. So if that doubles, to your point, well, shoot, that $1 million is now actually $600,000 because went from 20%
forget
to
the
40%.
market crashing.
Right.
All they have to do is change the tax rate from 20% to 40%.
Right.
And your $1 million is now going from 800,000 if it's $1 million after taxes to 600,000. And that's a big problem because you don't control it.
Mm-hmm.
So what's the solution?
Yeah.
Right? That was two. The third way we can kind of get out of this thing, we talked about inflation, right? We printing money. We talked about raising taxes. The third one, which we believe is the least likely to happen at all, would be that the Congress and the House of Representatives and the president, everybody's going to have to get together and agree to make drastic cuts to spending. And I'm not saying by cuts slowing down the increases.
Right.
And we just don't see that happening because we have no historical evidence of it ever happening in the past. Right. No one's cutting welfare that we believe. Food stamps aren't getting cut. Your Social Security, I can't see anyone voting to cut that stuff. Go right down the list. Medicare, Medicaid, Department of Defense. That stuff's probably not going to happen. So we're really left with printing money or raising taxes.
Yeah, and that's not a political statement, right? Nope. Historically, once there is any sort of benefit or promise, that has not been taken back, right? Traditionally. So what do we do, to your point, right?
I would say the answer would be get with your financial professional and or your tax professional. And after you've done more research than this YouTube video, if you get to the point where you're convinced taxes are going up, like Jamie Dimon said, by within 10 years, that we've got such a big problem that they're going to be forced to raise taxes, if you believe that, the question is, what can we do between now and that 10-year window to minimize the damage to your tax-deferred accounts? And if you can do things like Roth conversions, and there's other things you can do to try to get as much of your money out of tax-deferred accounts before the tax brackets go up.
Yeah, and if you're working with a financial professional, I would say bring this up, right? Hey, the U.S. has all of this debt. With your financial plan, what are you doing to insulate yourself from some of these things that kind of could come on the horizon?
Yeah, don't be shy about saying you're paying your financial advisor. Don't be shy about saying, what are you doing to protect me from this risk?
Yep.
And if they say that's not my ball of wax, well, you either need to get an additional advisor on top of this advisor or find an advisor that not only manages your accounts, but takes in this risk, which we believe is a very real risk, every real as stock market correction to your portfolio.
Absolutely. Well, hey, thanks for joining us, and we'll see you on the next video.